Welcome to Insights. I'm Dick Goldberg. Divorce is tough enough when kids aren't involved, but if you add kids to the mix, it's even more of a minefield of trouble. After he was here sharing ideas with us on his last visit about how to best manage divorce without children, Dr. Ken Waldron returns today to advise us on the unique issues children throw into the mix and lessons he's learned over time to help. Dr. Waldron, a clinical psychologist, is a frequent court expert on the subject of custody and divorce. He lectures on the subject, he's published research in this area, and has been doing private practice with divorce for 30 years. Thanks for joining us again, Ken.
Thanks for having me.
Is it safe to say that divorces, when kids are involved, are a lot messier and trickier than otherwise?
Yes.
I would sure think so. Pretty obvious.
Without a doubt. It doubles the legal tasks involved because you have to make twice as many decisions, and it doubles the emotional tasks involved, too.
Wow. Now we're talking about marriages with kids under 18 here.
Correct.
Okay. Is it always a tragedy when people with kids get a divorce?
It depends on what you mean by that. It's a tragedy in the short term in that children don't enjoy the process and they don't enjoy growing up with separate parents. Most children wish their parents had stayed together. Mm-hmm. So it's sad and it's hard on kids in the short term. It's not a tragedy in terms of how the kids turn out. Oh. Kids are extremely resilient. When we look at the statistics on children, about 10% of children from intact marriage families have a range of difficulties, mental health problems, delinquency, and so on. That only goes up to about 25% when you have children from...
You say only?
Well,
that's a lot.
That's up quite a bit, but that means 75% of the children with separated parents are not having those difficulties. Okay. So the odds are actually in the favor of your kids getting through it in reasonably good shape. Kids are pretty resilient.
Okay. Maybe it would be good to review the last time you were here what you said about lessons of divorce, because I assume they'll apply plus what we're going to learn about the kids. So either you or I could summarize, maybe since you're the guest, why don't you take a shot at summarizing the main points of your last session of things to be careful of when you're going through a divorce when there aren't kids?
The main things to be careful of are letting emotions take the lead and letting emotions dictate decisions. Especially when you have children, there's a lot of fear of loss of the children, and there's a lot of fear that if you aren't controlling what happens to your children, they're going to be harmed in some way. Mm-hmm. And so that those fears and the anger at the other spouse in the process, if decisions are made based on those emotions, they're oftentimes mistakes.
Okay. And other things, lessons that might be important right off the top, things you can really do to make your kids more likely to be in that 25% who don't come out so well as a result of the behavior during the divorce process or the outcome of the divorce. What do you have to be careful of going through this and make sure you don't do?
Well, we have some pretty good research on what predicts how those kids are going to turn out. And the number one predictor is how well the parents communicate and cooperate with one another.
During the divorce?
During the divorce. One of the things that we know from the science is that the sooner parents start talking with one another about their children, the more likely they are to achieve a good co-parenting relationship down the road. This is kind of counterintuitive because at the time of the divorce, the last person in the world you want to talk to is your spouse. Mm-hmm. There's usually a lot of fear and anger. Perhaps your spouse had an affair. There might have been an incident or two of violent behavior around the time of a separation. About 30% of all domestic violence is separation-engendered violence, really? Violence that occurs at the time of separation. So there are a lot of reasons that people don't want to talk to each other, mm-hmm. and yet the people who end up with the best co-parenting relationships are the ones that started talking about their children's needs and interests closest to the time of separation and divorce.
Well, if you're a woman in a relationship where there's violence, and assuming the male is the perp, why would you want your husband to be involved? You'd want him involved as little as possible, wouldn't you, with the kids?
There are 6 different types of domestic violence patterns.
Oh.
One type is separation engendered, which is nonviolent people behaving violently during a separation. And that's actually about half the time it's women and half the time it's men.
What do the women do? What kind of violence?
They assault their partner.
But look, I never understood this. I mean, men can fight back better than women when you get into physical.
Women are in a much more vulnerable position with regard to injuries and are actually more likely to be killed, even in separation engendered violence, than are men. I'm not trying to minimize that type of violence. There are 5 other patterns of violent behavior, though, and in some of those, couple of those in particular, it would be wise not to want your children to be around the perpetrator. Because some of those are violent patterns. There's one type of violent pattern with men, for example, that they engage in the violence with their spouse, but after the separation, there's a significant increase in the chances of them engaging in violent behavior with the children. So there are some situations in which there's been spousal violence that children need to be protected from. But separation engendered violence usually happens around the time of separation and never again. Never before and never again. And that has to be treated sometimes because it can be very serious and it can be a traumatic experience for everybody in the family.
But you're saying...
But you don't want to keep children away from that parent.
Why do parents fight so badly sometimes over when there isn't violence involved? But still, you have these terrific fights I hear about. Maybe it's just because I hear about those and it doesn't happen often. But why do they fight so much and so with such fervor?
Over the children?
Yeah.
There are a lot of reasons that they do that. One of the biggest is the fear of loss. You do lose your children in a divorce. You lose at least some of the time with them. It might be just some weekends, it might be whole weeks at a time, but you lose time with your kids. That's not natural. It's we've had millions of years of evolution in which we've become protective parents and expect to be around and to be able to protect our children. And it's not natural to go through blocks of time and not be with your children, particularly with young children. It's built into the species to want to be able to spend a lot of time daily with a child. So you're going against nature to some extent. You're also experiencing a good deal of real loss. You're losing a lot of time with the kids. That's one of the reasons the co-parenting relationship is so predictive of outcomes, because if parents are cooperative with one another, they can really reduce the amount of loss that they experience with their children.
Why would they do that? How would that help with the loss?
If parents are engaged in good communication and cooperation, a parent can call the other parent up and say, I'm kind of missing the kids. Do you mind if I stop by and pick them up and take them to the park for an hour or two? That's good for the kids and that's good for the parents. So you reduce the loss. If you have a good co-parenting relationship, you can go over and see the Halloween costume before the kids go out trick-or-treating. You can come over and take pictures of the 16-year-old going to a dance. So in a good co-parenting relationship, you substantially reduce the amount of loss.
So I'm hearing implicitly this thought. If you're going through a divorce and there's kids involved, if you are angry and you're fighting with your soon-to-be ex-spouse, know that you're hurting your relationship with your kids.
You know you're not only hurting your relationship with your kids, but you're hurting your chances of participating in important parts of your kids' lives.
Yeah. And are you hurting your kids directly because of the conflict between you two?
There's damage to the kids in 2 ways. When parents have conflict with one another, there's the obvious damage of kids witnessing that conflict and having to deal with it. Parents saying mean things about one another, having arguments at transitions. None of us like that experience. When we see 2 people arguing in a store, we become uncomfortable. Well, kids magnify that because they love these people that are having this conflict. The second way you hurt kids when you have conflict like that is that kids internalize their parents as part of their identities. There's a little dad inside the child, and there's a little mom inside the child, and that becomes an important part of the identity. And when parents conflict with one another, that goes inside the child, and the child actually begins having internal conflicts between those two different parts of their identity. And there's a high chance that they're going to act that out when they get older and start looking for partners themselves. They're going to want to act out those same conflicts. When I do interviews with parents who are going through divorce, and particularly in a conflictual divorce, they inevitably grew up with some kind of conflict in their own family, similar to what they have with their spouse. So parents are hurting their kids two ways. One is just making their kids darn uncomfortable, but they're also giving their children a destiny to repeat some of those same conflicts in their own adulthood.
Can you kind of give an example, a case where you can think of someone who replayed something that happened as a kid and flesh that out with an example?
I could give lots of examples. One of the most profound examples is in a certain type of situation where one parent is promoting the children to become estranged from the other parent. Enters into kind of an alliance with the children to turn the children against the other
say
parent.
Bad things. A woman might say bad things about dad or vice versa.
Yeah, tell the children, he doesn't really love you. He's just trying to buy you. Mm-hmm. He doesn't want to pay child support, or she just wants the money. Mm-hmm. Making the kids doubt that the other parent loves them, sometimes making the kids frightened of the other parent. When I go in and do an evaluation in those cases and talk with that parent, in their own families of background, they inevitably have family rifts. There's other estrangements in their family of origin, and they're essentially repeating that same dynamic with their own spouse and ex-spouse and children.
Does it matter if the kids are 2 years old or 12 years old and working this out? Is age a big issue?
Makes a huge difference. The problem with parents separating is that children have to spend time with both parents in two different homes. And children under about 5 years old have a very, very difficult time doing that. The research on children in that age group shows that only about a third of the kids come out of it unscathed. About 2/3 have from moderate to severe difficulties. So parents who are separating that have really young children are in a particularly difficult situation. Very, very hard to get kids through that.
Why? Why is that so hard?
Because the developmental tasks are so profound. They're going through attachment development, attachment reification, task-oriented behavior, the foundations of industry. The foundations of most of the child's personality are built in the first 5 years of life. And it's very, very difficult for children in that age group to go back and forth between two houses on any schedule. Without doing some damage to those really building blocks for their future.
Is it that they feel insecure without mom and dad in the same house, or what is it that makes it so hard for them?
Well, take attachment, which is one of the most important developmental tasks that children have. Children become attached in the first 3 years of life. Their primary attachments are usually to their parents, or sometimes another adult or two who are playing an important caregiving role. And attachments form the foundation of the relationships that they're going to have for the rest of their life. Well, young children can't be away from an attachment figure for very long without doing damage to that attachment. They don't have the cognitive ability to spend more than a few days away from an attachment figure and keep the same level of attachment. So their attachment begins to drift off after they're away from that person for a little while. When they see them, it's not memory. They have a perfect memory at 2 years old. But that feeling of attachment diminishes. And so what happens is they end up with this cycle of attachment going up when they're with them and down when they're away from them and then back up. And those are people who grow up to really run hot and cold in relationships and to have relationships where one day they are like your best friend, and the next day they act like they hardly know you. They have this attachment pattern that really doesn't work well.
So they have a hard time having a good, healthy, close, intimate relationship.
Correct.
Wow. Okay, so what can people going through a divorce with little kids learn from what you're saying? Or how can they change their behavior to reduce the damage?
Well, we know that a third of the kids in that age group come through okay, and we've studied that third, and it turns out that the parents have to be almost perfect.
Wow.
They have to have frequent contact with the child. Both parents have to play important caretaking roles with the child, preferably without the child going back and forth between two homes.
How do you do that? They don't go back and forth.
I had one case where the parents really did love their two young children, and what they did was the mother kept the children in the one home, and the father would come into that home 4 and 5 evenings a week, help feed the children, bathe them, put them to bed, so that he could also become an attachment figure for the children without the children having to go back and forth between two homes.
Would mom leave when he'd come?
Sometimes, sometimes not.
That's a pretty infrequent kind of thing, isn't it? That's
Pretty infrequent.
Other than that, any other suggestions?
Well, if I were going through a divorce with young children, I would have the children live in one home and arrange to have frequent contact with them until they were about 4 or 5 years old. Then you can begin to go into a residential schedule.
But you'd have them sleep in that same home every night.
Correct. That's what I would do, just to protect those attachments and the stability in those first 5 years.
That's pretty infrequent, isn't it?
That's pretty infrequent.
Wow.
And parents tend to want to get their time with their children, and sometimes are very disruptive to the child's development.
Okay. When you have one kid versus 4 kids, how different is that?
Makes a huge difference. The sibling group is a huge buffer against the stresses. Take the case of the young child, for example. If you have a 3-year-old, but they have, say, 2 or 3 older siblings going back and forth, they're much less likely to have their development disrupted because the sibling group itself is a huge buffer against a lot of stress.
You do a lot of evaluations, from what I understand, where the court says, tell us about what we should do about custody, right? That's what an evaluation
Correct.
is. When do people need to be evaluated, the kids, versus you can work it out? What are you called upon? For what reasons?
Well, I get called in to do evaluations in high conflict cases, cases in which the lawyers, guardian ad litem, the judge aren't sure what to do because of the high conflict. And they can be allegations of history of domestic violence, allegations of mistreatment of the child. So I get called into cases where the factors are unusual because only about 15 to 20% of divorces are high conflict.
If you have 4 children, is it a more complicated divorce than if you have one? I understand that the kids have each other as buffers, but is the process more difficult?
I don't think the process is any more difficult. It's the same legal tasks involved with 4 as is involved with 1. Sometimes there are complicated decisions because you have one child that's involved in some extracurricular activities and one child that's still in diapers. So sometimes the logistics are more complicated, but the legal task and the emotional tasks I haven't seen be any different.
Well, what about you got 2 boys and 2 girls, and mom says the girls should be with me more, they're girls, and the boys should be with dad more, they're boys. What's your thoughts?
My thought is we have no science that supports that.
Okay.
There is no science that says girls should be with mothers and boys should be with fathers. What the science says is that children of both sexes have their best chance at growing up and being well adjusted if they have substantial time with both parents.
Okay, so the mom who's saying, he's not as good a parent as me, they need more time with me, advice for her?
My advice for her would be coach him to be a better parent.
Oh.
And if you want your kids to grow up and be well adjusted, make sure that they have substantial time with him.
But let's say...
As long as he's good enough.
Oh, what does that mean?
As long as he's not dangerous, as long as he's not neglectful.
But let's say he's a little below average guy in nurturing skills, which I assume is a little below the average woman in nurturing skills. And she says he's kind of a doofus. He's not a bad person, but he doesn't know how to tend to others. He's a little self-centered and self-absorbed, but he's not evil. Now what? Should he get equal time?
Well, I'm not an advocate of equal time.
Okay.
That's a principle that has to do with property division, not raising
joint
children.
custody.
No, there's no child in an intact family that could tell you what percentage of time they spend with each parent. And the types of time that they spend with the parents, they might spend more time with one parent than the other, but the time that they spend with the other parent might be more important to their development. So the equal time business is really a construct in the law that has to do with property. It has nothing to do with raising children.
But it happens. Right?
Oh, it happens. People want to get their fair share of their child.
Okay.
Children were possessions until a little over 100 years ago. So there's still, the word custody means to hold and control a possession. It doesn't mean anything about parenting.
Okay, what I'm hearing you say is if you care about the kids, have civility with the person you're divorcing. Work it out with them. Work out what's in the best interest of the kids.
Well, it's more than just being civil. We actually have some pretty good science on what it takes to raise kids well as separated parents. And it means having a system of flexibility with the schedule and not following the schedule rigidly. It means paying some attention to the transitions because that's a stress point for kids going back and forth. It means sharing information about the child back and forth so that both parents know what's going on in all parts of the child's life. It means coordinating the parenting across homes so that you're having basically the same rules, the same level of responsibilities. You're dealing with homework in a similar way. You have similar routines, and it means making a list of the types of decisions that have to be made by both parents and having a procedure in place for making those decisions successfully.
Well, come on now. Without a guy like Ken Waldron helping them, how many people are going to do that?
About 50% of all divorces with children have parents who work out a fairly good co-parenting arrangement without any assistance.
And they go through all those steps and talk about all those things?
Well, they don't have the technical knowledge, but they know that there's things that they can do that make going back and forth easier on their kids. So they don't give them a 40-pound suitcase every time they go. They have sets of clothes in both houses. They know how to get property back and forth so the kid can bring something that he really wants to bring to the other house. So they work out the logistics of transitions. They don't argue with transitions. So there are a lot of parents who instinctively know what types of things they need to do to have their kids come out okay. And then there's a percentage of parents who, if they had the technical knowledge, would do it. And I do a lot of co-parenting counseling and give them the technical skills on how to do it, and they do it. And then there's people who will fight and argue and have conflict no matter what you do.
Wouldn't it be in the interest of children in America going through divorce to have every couple have to see someone to discuss how you're going to handle the custody afterwards and go through all the things you're talking about?
We've actually got that.
We have a law?
We don't have, well, we do have laws. Back in about 1990, there was one or two parent education programs in the nation. Almost every jurisdiction in the world now has a parent education program as a requirement of getting a divorce if you have children. And people have to get in the programs, depending on location, run for anywhere from 2 hours to 8 hours, in which parents are provided that information.
How do you know they were nodding off during the whole time? I mean, they don't have to pass an exam to show they were paying attention?
I don't know if they're nodding off, and some probably are, but most people going through a divorce are very sincere about wanting their kids to come through it in good shape, so I suspect most pay attention in those classes.
What do you get most frustrated about when you observe couples going through divorce with kids?
I think the most frustrating thing is really a recent phenomenon, and by recent I mean in the last 10 or 15 years of my practice, is that parents going through a divorce are, on average, a little bit more self-centered and a little less focused on their children than, say, they were 10 or 15 years ago.
How does that play out?
Well, they become focused on, for example, a father might say, I want 50-50, regardless of whether or not that's actually good for a child. 10 or 15 years ago, you would see fathers saying, I'm not sure what to do, I want to do what's best for my kid. More so now, people seem a little more self-centered, and I see parents feel entitled to get what they want with their kids and don't really think about it as kids' time with their parents. They think about it as the parents' time with the kid.
Gee, that's too bad. You know, you had mentioned to us on your last visit about people who are getting a divorce. Most of them, if they had come to someone like you when they were just trying to work out all the conflicts that inevitably arise in a marriage after that love cycle ends, if they had come to a good marriage therapist, they could have worked them through and not gotten a divorce. Well, when people have 3 or 4 kids, or a kid who's 10, they've had a long time. Would they have averted a divorce too if they gotten help earlier?
In a lot of cases, I would say yes. It depends a little bit, though, because I mentioned in the previous program that parents or the spouses have to wrestle with control issues. One of the things that happens in a lot of marriages is that the control issue is over how to raise the kids. That they have substantial differences in their histories, their families of origin, different strategies with raising kids. And some of those different ways are really irreconcilable. They really just don't work.
Can you give an example of an irreconcilable?
Well, in one situation, you might have one parent, for example, who's very authoritative, is very strict, likes things done a certain way, and the other parent might be very permissive, very nurturing, but very permissive. Those two styles really clash.
How are they going to work when they separate and the kids are with them separately?
As long as their routines are relatively the same, it doesn't matter what their styles are once they're separate. Style and parenting skill sets are two different things entirely. So mom can have a bedtime of 8 o'clock and mean lights out, in bed, no more talking. She can be very strict. Dad can have an 8 o'clock bedtime and be laying in bed reading to his kids at 5 after 8, saying goodnight, and leave the room. As long as the routine is the same, kids are likely to do okay and be able to adjust to the different parenting styles. So a divorce can be a solution to substantially different parenting styles.
So the kids in some cases might be better off if the parents separated and they had joint custody than living under the same roof with 2 conflicting parents about how to raise kids?
It can be. Well, in that example, for example, it would be better for the kids to have those 2 different styles in 2 different homes than to be in the same home with mom yelling at dad, get out of there, it's bedtime.
Yes. Yeah. Do you think sometimes the introduction of children ruins a marriage? Kills a marriage?
I don't know about kills a marriage, but it presents certain challenges that can lead to a divorce. Disagreements over parenting is one of the top contenders for leading to a divorce. The control issues over parenting are really pretty tough if the differences are substantial.
What I'm thinking about is a marriage that is okay, but you add the stress of kids and it goes from okay to not okay. But if the kids weren't there, they'd probably stay together.
I don't know that I know the answer to that
Or
question.
people who are pretty self-centered, the 2 of them, but the 2 of them get by. When you add a kid that you have to pay attention to, the equation really gets out of whack.
I think that could very well be true. That could very well be true.
And then one final question for you.
Okay.
I have read, when you ask people, are you glad you had kids? Almost everyone says, absolutely, best thing I ever did. But if you ask them moment to moment, from the time their kids introduced in their life till they go off to college, moment to moment shows their happiness goes down those whole 18 years and goes back up when the kids leave the house. You ever heard that?
I've not heard that, but I believe it.
Do you?
I believe I've had 5 children, all of whom have left the house. They are everything that we do that has meaning in life is not always easy.
Okay.
And some of the things that we do in our lives that have meaning actually reduce our happiness. And I think raising children can do that. There's a lot of joy in raising kids, but it can also reduce your personal happiness because there's a duty to your children to put their needs and interests ahead of your own. And sometimes that means you're less happy.
That's wisely put, Ken. Ken Waldron, thanks very much for being with us, and I hope you'll join us on the next edition of Insights.